Hello, welcome to Overview on Protest presented by CRI. CRI provides back office support in the areas of contracts, accounting, finance, and HR. By covering the back office, CRI allows you to focus on your business and its growth. I'm Jay Gruendl. I'm the Director of Contracts here at CRI. I have over 20 years experience in contracts at companies both big and small. And the one question that led to the development of this presentation is, should we protest? Whether you're in a small company or a big company and you receive a notice that you are not the successful offer, there's usually an owner, a vice president, or a capture manager who's idly asking if they should consider a protest. Although the old axiom is the only cost of a protest is a stamp, the truth of the matter is it's a significant investment. You'll almost always want to engage a government contracting lawyer who's well-versed in protests, and you'll spend a fair amount of corporate time and resources providing the necessary support and data for the protest. Also, as all of this is being done, it's usually up against some very tight deadlines. So with that in mind, let's take a look at protests and what we need to consider when answering the question on whether we should protest. In this presentation, we'll look at the latest statistics on protests. We'll take a brief look at a recent case, and with that case in mind, we'll review protest types, the timelines, the outcomes, and some of the limits on protests. From there, we'll revisit our case and how it was adjudicated. Finally, we'll wind up the presentation with a couple of other reasons why a company might protest. Here you see the latest GAO statistics on protests. As you can see, over the last 5 years, particularly the last 4, there's been a steady increase in protests, usually at about a 5% clip year over year. However, you will notice in 2010 there was a large increase in protests, and I believe in 2008 and 2009 there are also some large upticks in protests. What you'll see in the presentation is how that large uptick has affected protests today. If you look at the second blue line, you'll see that the decision rate on protests continues to hover at around 20%. And then looking at the third blue line, you'll see the sustain rate for the most part is usually around 16 to 18%, although you will see in 2014 the sustain rate was down. It was around 12.95%. Also, 13% of most protests are related to task orders under IDIQ contracts, and we will discuss those type of protests a little later in the presentation. So the statistics might look a little bleak, especially in 2014. Of the 2,500 plus protests, only 22% went all the way to a decision. And of the ones that went to a decision, only about 13% were sustained. This means about 13% of overall protests were officially sustained. However, if you look at the bottom row, you'll see the effectiveness rate for protests continues to be 42 or 43% year over year. What this means is that 40% of the cases had corrective action taken by the agency. In other words, the agency recognized there was some sort of problem and most likely redid the procurement. This brings us to our first major consideration, and that is, what is the goal of the protest? Very rarely does a protest result in a direct award to the protester. A successful protest usually results in a do-over of the procurement, often with fewer bidders, usually just the protester and the awardee. So with that in mind, let's take a look at a recent protest. This is a case that was just adjudicated a few months ago in December of 2014. American Auto Logistics, or AAL, protested an award for a contract to transport the automobiles of government civilians and military families being stationed from overseas or returning from overseas. Per the award criteria, the offers had to be found technically acceptable. From there, the government would consider trade-offs between past performance and price. AAL had the superior past performance and was just a little bit above the offer in price. However, the award was given to the other offerer, and AAL protested. They protested on the grounds that the agency either did not do the trade-off like they said in the RFP, or the trade-off decision was unreasonable. With that protest in mind, we'll look at the FAR guideline on protests and the timelines involved. One of the first considerations is the form in which to protest. You can protest directly to the procuring agency, or you can protest to the General Accounting Office, or GAO, or you can protest to the Court of Federal Claims. In an agency protest, your protest goes directly to the agency and the agency adjudicates it. This is usually for an obvious mistake, something very black and white, and you don't want to spend a lot of money. Also, the protest and the decision are not made public. If the basis of the protest is more complex, however, your best bet is the GAO or the Court of Federal Claims. In a GAO protest, the agency responds to the GAO, and the GAO then adjudicates the protest. This is the most common form for a protest. The decisions are made public and the costs are higher. But if you have a more complex protest, this is your best bet. The Court of Federal Claims is usually for very large and very complex protests. Usually the procurement was a high dollar procurement and the stakes are much higher. These protests are by far more expensive. However, the deadlines are not as strict. So now that we've looked at the three forms, let's look at the types of protests. There are two basic protests, pre-award and post-award. As the name would suggest, a pre-award protest is a protest that occurs before the final award has been made. In a pre-award protest, you could either be protesting the RFP or you could be protesting an issue that led you to be eliminated from competition. An RFP protest is usually about the requirements in the RFP. Either they're overly restrictive or on the other end of the scale, they're vague or possibly conflicting. Also, you could protest an unreasonable timeline in the RFP, or perhaps there was some issue with it being a set-aside, or it should have been a set-aside. If the pre-award protest is based on a down select or elimination from competition, then the issues will tend to be similar to the post-award protest. And post-award protests are most common. As the name suggests, the post-award protest is when your notice of being eliminated from competition usually occurs at the time of award, and the protest obviously occurs after the award has been made. The post-award protest is where you feel there's an issue with the evaluation, or there was a procedural error, or perhaps there's some sort of OCI with the winner. Now we've looked at the two types, let's look at the timelines. Another key consideration on the protest decision is the timing of events. First and foremost is getting the debrief, because without one, it will be hard to submit a credible protest. Whether you received notice that you are not the successful offer in a pre-award or post-award environment, you must submit the debrief, the request for debrief, within 3 days of being notified that you are excluded from competition. These 3 days are calendar days. So it's no surprise that quite often these notices happen on Fridays or holidays. In fact, I have had contracting officers admit freely and openly they do this to try and cut down on the debriefs and the protests. Once the debrief has been requested, it should occur within 5 days of the request. Your main takeaway here is to always ask for a debrief the minute you get the notice. This past Thanksgiving at about 10 o'clock in the morning, CRI was actually submitting a request for debrief on behalf of one of our customers because their notice of being eliminated from competition was actually posted at 2 a.m. Thanksgiving morning. But there's no reason for delay, and if you miss the deadline, it could effectively end your chance at a protest. So if you decide to proceed with a protest, and if you decide you want to protest to the agency, here are the deadlines you need to be aware of. If the RFP was unreasonable or too vague, or it should have been a set-aside, you have to protest before the proposal due date, before submission of proposals or bid opening. This is tricky because quite often something comes out of the debrief after you've been eliminated from competition where there's a clarification of a misunderstanding about the RFP, and now based on what you know about the RFP, you consider that to be unreasonable and you want to protest. Unfortunately, in this situation, that a protest at that point based on the RFP is too late. If your protest is for other than the RFP, then you have 10 days after you've learned or you should have known about the basis of the protest. The phrase should have known about is related to when the debrief was offered. And the important thing to know here is when the debrief was offered. If you request a debrief in a timely fashion and you're offered a debrief on Monday and that doesn't work for you, and by mutual agreement with the government, you get a debrief on Friday, That's fine. However, the clock did start on Monday when the debrief was offered. Also, a pre-award protest holds up the award until it's resolved. A post-award protest has the same 10-day timeline for submittal, and it also has a second timeline for sustaining performance. By sustaining performance, that means the winner of the contract cannot start performance on the contract. If a protest is submitted within 10 days of award or 5 days after the debrief was offered, then the awardee may not begin work on the new contract. Quite often, if this is a recompete, the work continues on the old contract. Agency protests are supposed to be resolved within 35 days of when the protest was filed. GAO protests have very similar timelines. However, on a side note, if you look in the FAR on pre-award protest timelines, it's not addressed directly. What you'll see is a reference to the CFR, and if you go to the CFR reference, you'll find that an RFP protest must be before bid submission, just like the agency level protest. Also, we feel an RFP protest is usually better handled at the agency level. All other protests must be 10 days from when the basis of the protest was known or the debrief was offered. Again, in order to sustain performance, the protest must be 10 days from award or 5 days from when the debrief was offered, whichever is longer. Once the protest is filed, the agency must submit a report to the GAO within 30 days of notice. After that, the protester has 10 days to respond to the agency report. Upon response, the GAO has 60 days to make their decision. So from protest filing to adjudication for a GAO level protest is 100 days. All of these deadlines are hard deadlines. When protesting to the Court of Federal Claims, the RFP protest is the same as the other two, but the post-award protest is much looser. There's no 10-day limit for the post-award protest. The court just looks at whether it was filed in a timely fashion. We have seen cases where the court accepts a protest or hears a protest a couple of months after the award was made. Also, there's no automatic stay of execution in a Court of Federal Claims protest. If you want a stay of execution, you must convince the judge to issue a TRO, a temporary restraining order. Now that we've looked at the deadline for filing protests, let's look at some of the limitations on protests. If you remember before when we're looking at the statistics, 13% of protests are related to task orders. In order to protest a task order, the value of the task order must be over $10 million. There was a time when you couldn't protest a task order at all. However, with the proliferation of IDIQ contracts and GWACs, the law was changed and now you can protest a task order over $10 million. Also, you're entitled to a debrief if the task order is over $5 million. For a set-aside, you have a very narrow area for protesting. Basically, you're protesting that the offer was not qualified to receive an award. For example, if the offer was for an 8A set-aside and the awardee graduated from the 8A program before he submitted his proposal, then he was not qualified. Or you can protest that if it's a small business set-aside, that the business that won the award did not fit the size standard. Also, to protest, you must be an interested party or you must have standing. To be an interested party means if you want to file a protest against the terms of an RFP, you have to be a potential bidder. An example would be if a set-aside is for a woman-owned company and a non-woman-owned company, such as a large business, maybe a sub, wants to protest the terms of the RFP, they're not a potential bidder, so they would not be able to protest. Also, you must have standing. That means for a post-award protest, you basically have to be the next in line. If there are 5 people bidding and you finished 4th, you would not have standing because even if the government had made a mistake, even a substantial mistake, it really wouldn't have affected you because you were not in line to win. So if you have a valid protest and it was submitted on the deadline, what are the possible outcomes? There are 4 possible outcomes. The first is a withdrawal by the protester. An example of this would be maybe a GAO protest where the agency report is received. The protester looks at it and decides he would no longer like to pursue the protest. Another outcome is the protest could be dismissed. It could be dismissed for a technical or procedural flaw, such as not having standing or missing a deadline, but most common, a protest is dismissed because the agency decides to take corrective action. They realize the protester is right, or they have word that the GAO will sustain the protest, and it is not uncommon for the GAO to convey this to the agency, or other flaws come out in the evaluation. We did have an instance where a CRI customer a few years ago won a contract and the award was protested. Looking at the basis of the award, we thought there was very low chance of a sustainment. However, what we found out during the protest was there were other errors that were made that weren't related to the reason for the protest, and based on those errors, the agency decided to take corrective action. Also, a protest could be dismissed if the agency decides they want to take corrective action and just get to the award quicker. A third possible outcome is the protest could be denied, and that is the GAO looks at the case and rules in favor of the government. Finally, the last outcome could be the protest is sustained. The GAO has recently started reporting the reasons for sustainment, and they are pretty much in order the following bullets. The first is failure to follow the solicitation. An example is where a solicitation may require that only the primes can use past performances in their proposal. If this is the case, and then during evaluation, one of the offers used sub-past performances and the government allowed it, then obviously they wouldn't be following what was in the solicitation, and this could be a reason for sustaining the protest. Another reason could be inadequate documentation. It's not uncommon, and sometimes the government is encouraged to look not only at the past performance that's submitted, but to look at the government database on past performance to see if there are potential performance issues. If the government does this, but they don't say what they found, they just say something like, yeah, we found this offer had some past performance that gave us concern, and they didn't say what the past performance was or why, then that really wouldn't be adequate documentation, and the protest could be sustained. Third is unequal treatment of the offers. Again, in this instance, if we look at an example where maybe past performance was used and they looked at their database, but they didn't look at it for all the offers, especially if they didn't look at it for the awardee, then obviously the offers weren't being treated equally, and that could result in a sustainment of the performance. Finally, and this is a tough one, a protest could be sustained for unreasonable cost or price evaluation. The reason this is tough is because the GAO gives tremendous leeway to the evaluators. In fact, you'll notice in the bullets that what's missing from this GAO list is how the agency did the evaluation. That's because the GAO has stated on many occasions that they will not reevaluate the proposals, and quite often they side with how the evaluation was done as long as it was consistent with the RFP. This brings us to a very important and one of your most common considerations on whether to protest. If you do not like how you were evaluated, in other words, you felt you should have gotten a higher grade, then you probably have a very low probability of winning that protest. I know that's frustrating because people have put a lot of hard work into it, but the agency, the GAO, is really looking at failure to follow the solicitation or documentation, not on the evaluation. So, with this in mind, let's take a look at the case we reviewed earlier. The government looks like they followed the first award criteria. They found both to be technically acceptable. However, did they follow the trade-off criteria? AAL had a better past performance and a slightly higher price. However, the offerer won the award. The outcome of the proposal was it was denied. The government was able to show in their documentation that they did in fact consider the trade-off between price and past performance. They did not think that the better past performance was worth the additional 3.9%. The GAO found it to be within the agency's discretion not to accept the higher price. They even noted that they backed the past performance evaluations. In fact, when I first read about this protest, it seemed like a long shot, and I wondered why they had protested. And this leads us to our final section, which is other reasons for a protest. There are a few strategic reasons for protests where corrective action or sustainment might not be the number one goal. The sample protest was for a procurement that turned out to be for several hundred millions of dollars. The protester was the incumbent, and they filed in time to sustain performance. So 100 extra days of performance on the old contract probably netted them $30 to $40 million in additional revenue. If they somehow were lucky and were able to force a corrective action and the procurement had to be redone, then they would have continued performance for an even longer period of time and realized considerably more revenue. This could have been the reason for their protest. Both the GAO and industry believe there are protests that are merely to extend performance. Also, the GAO has stated that they believe another reason is some people are protesting because of poor debriefs. As we talked about, their protests have been steadily rising, and there was quite a bubble there back in the 2008, 2009, 2010 timeframe. Agencies started putting less and less in their debrief, and they were taking a more conservative interpretation of what the FAR says are the minimum requirements for a debrief. As a result, there's increased frustration by the industry on the lack of detail in some debriefs. Since the attorneys get to see the source selection documentation, the GAO believes that some protests are just to get a better look at why they lost. I'm not sure if that's true, but there is some plausibility to the theory. So what are the main takeaways from this presentation? There are four main takeaways. The first is the most likely favorable outcome of a protest is another shot at the bid, possibly with only two bidders. The second takeaway is protests do cost money, and they're usually up against tight deadlines. The third are protests for set-asides are very limited. So sometimes the answer to that question, should we protest, is a very quick no because it was a set-aside. And finally, I know it's frustrating to think you're unfairly graded in your proposal, especially when you spent nights and weekends putting it together, but protesting, that type of protest has a very low probability of success. Thank you for attending. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions. This will also be posted on YouTube later today. Also, feel free to contact me if you need any contracts, finance, or HR support.